There was a small package sitting on the front porch that afternoon. It wasn't large, slightly smaller than a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. Mia noticed it the moment she stepped out of her car, and for a second, she just stood there, staring at it. She had been checking the mailbox every single day for weeks. Every day, nothing. And now, here it was. Her hands were trembling. She hadn't expected that. She reached down and picked it up carefully, like it might disappear if she moved too fast, and walked through the front door into the living room, where her grandmother was sitting.
"Grandma, open this."
Dorothy Callahan looked up from the sofa, confused for a moment. Then took the box from her granddaughter's hands. She looked down at the label, and something in her face shifted in a way that Mia had been hoping for, and quietly dreading, all at once. But to understand what that moment meant, you have to go back to the beginning. Dorothy Callahan was 68 years old and had lived in Dayton, Ohio for most of her life. Before she retired, she had spent over 30 years teaching elementary school. The neighborhood still called her Miss Dot, even a decade after she'd turned in her lesson plans for the last time. Her mornings were quiet and deliberate. She brewed a pot of coffee, filled the bird feeder out back, and settled into the sofa by the window to watch the day begin. She was not the kind of woman who needed much, but there was one thing she had kept close for a very long time. It was Christmas morning, 1993. Dorothy had just turned 40. Her husband Frank placed a wrapped box in her hands with that slightly sheepish smile he always got when he wasn't sure he'd done the right thing. Inside was a gray handheld game console and a copy of Tetris. Dorothy laughed when she saw it. She told him she wasn't sure a 40-year-old woman had any business with a children's video game. Frank just shrugged and nudged her to try it once before she made up her mind. She tried it once, then again. Then she lost track of time entirely. There was something about Tetris that cleared her head in a way nothing else quite did. The blocks came down one at a time, and all she had to do was figure out where they fit. Nothing else existed in those moments. Not the stack of papers she hadn't graded, not the worry about her mother's health, not the long list of things waiting to be done. Just the blocks, the screen, and the quiet click of the buttons beneath her thumbs. Frank used to lean against the kitchen doorway and watch her with a grin, shaking his head in that fond, amused way of his. It became one of their quiet routines. He would appear, she would not look up, and they would both pretend this was a perfectly normal thing for a grown woman to be doing at 11 o'clock on a weeknight. Frank died the winter Dorothy turned 54. A heart attack, sudden and without warning. There was no time to say goodbye, no time to prepare. Dorothy moved through the weeks that followed in a kind of fog she still cannot fully describe. She kept going to the grocery store, kept feeding the birds, kept making coffee every morning. And every night, she sat on that sofa and played Tetris. She didn't talk about it much. It wasn't something she could easily put into words. But in those long, quiet hours after Frank was gone, watching the blocks fall and the rows disappear felt like the only thing that made sense. Things came down. You found a place for them. And then there was space again. She got through it, one game at a time. A few years later, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. The treatment was long and exhausting. There were appointments, medications, days when getting out of bed took everything she had. She brought the game console with her to the hospital. She played in the waiting room before her treatments. And she played in the dark of early mornings when the nausea made sleep impossible. The blocks kept falling. She kept placing them. She got through that too. Mia was Dorothy's granddaughter, 16 years old. And she stopped by her grandmother's house after school more days than not. It was the kind of routine that had settled into place. Without anyone deciding it, Dorothy would have hot chocolate ready. Mia would spread her homework across the kitchen table. And sometimes Dorothy would take out the old game console and play for a while. Mia would watch over her shoulder, genuinely amazed at how fast her grandmother's hands moved across the buttons. The console stopped working on a Tuesday in October. Dorothy pressed the power button and nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. She swapped out the batteries, cleaned the contacts with a cotton swab. Pressed the button one more time. The screen stayed dark. She set it down on the coffee table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it in the drawer and closed it quietly. When Mia came over that afternoon, she noticed right away that the console was not in its usual spot. Dorothy mentioned it briefly, keeping her voice light, saying it was nothing to worry about, that it was just an old piece of equipment that had finally given out. But Mia had seen the way Dorothy's hand had lingered on the drawer before she let it go. That small hesitation told her everything. The next morning, Mia drove to a repair shop across town. The man behind the counter turned the console over in his hands, examined it for less than a minute, and shook his head. The components were too old. Replacement parts simply didn't exist anymore. She tried a second shop. The answer was the same. At the third shop, the owner barely looked at it before suggesting she search for a replacement online, as though the thing in her hands were already beyond saving. Mia drove back and sat in her grandmother's driveway for a few minutes before going inside. She was thinking. That night, she sat at her desk and looked up the American office of the company that had manufactured the console. They had a customer relations division based in Redmond, Washington. She found the mailing address, pulled out a piece of notebook paper, and picked up a pen. She sat there for a long while before she started writing. She was 16, and she had never written a letter to a corporation before. She understood perfectly well that it might go unread, that it might be sorted into a pile and forgotten. She wrote it anyway. She introduced herself simply. She explained that her grandmother had owned one of their older handheld consoles since 1993. She explained that her grandfather had given it to her as a gift, and that he had since passed away. She wrote, as clearly and plainly as she could, about what the console had meant to her grandmother through the years. The grief after losing Frank, the months of cancer treatment, the long nights when the world felt too heavy. She described how the console had sat on the side table every single day of her grandmother's life, how it had been there through everything, and how it had finally stopped working. She asked, without drama or expectation, whether anything could be done. The letter was short. It was not particularly well crafted. It was simply honest. She sealed it, addressed it carefully, and mailed it the following morning. Then she tried her best to move on and not think about it. She almost managed it. She checked the mailbox every day anyway. And every day it was empty, and by the end of the second week, she had mostly convinced herself that she had done what she could and that was enough. It had been worth trying. 3 weeks after she mailed the letter, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost let it go to voicemail. The voice on the other end was calm and professional and warm. The caller introduced herself as being with the customer relations team at the company's American office. She said they had received the letter. She said the team had passed it around, and that everyone who read it had been moved by it. Mia sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. The caller explained that repairing the original console was not going to be possible. The components were far too old, and there was no realistic way to source what would be needed. But, she continued, they had gone back through their storage inventory, and they had found a small number of that exact model, brand new and never opened, still sitting in a warehouse. They wanted to send one to Dorothy, free of charge, if Mia would allow it. Mia could not speak for a moment. She pressed her hand flat against her knee and stared at the wall across from her bed. And tried to absorb what she had just heard. Then she gave them her grandmother's address. Thanked them as steadily as she could manage, and ended the call. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. After that, not moving, just breathing. The package arrived 10 days later. Mia carried it inside without opening it. She walked into the living room where Dorothy was sitting in her usual spot on the sofa. The afternoon light falling across her lap. The television murmuring in the background. She held the box out without saying much, just her grandmother's name, just enough. Dorothy took it. She looked down at the label. Then up at her granddaughter's face, searching for an explanation. Mia offered none. She just waited. Dorothy's hands moved slowly across the packaging. She peeled back the outer layer, lifted the flaps. Moved aside the cushioning inside. And then she stopped. Sitting in the box was a game console. The same model as the one in the drawer. The same gray casing, the same shape, the same worn texture along the grip. Except it was brand new. Completely untouched. Dorothy lifted it out of the box with both hands and held it the way you hold something you weren't sure you'd ever see again. She turned it over slowly. She ran her thumb along the side. She found the power button and pressed it. The screen lit up. The startup screen appeared, and then the familiar title screen. And then the music began. It was the same melody Dorothy had heard thousands of times across 30 years. Rising now from a brand new speaker. In a quiet living room on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in Dayton, Ohio. Dorothy did not cry. Her eyes filled, and the tears gathered there, still and bright. But they did not fall. She took a slow breath. And then she started to play. The blocks came down. She placed them, one by one, reading the screen the way she had always read it. Her hands already knowing what to do before her mind had finished deciding. A row completed and disappeared. Then another. Mia sat down beside her and said nothing. She watched her grandmother's hands move with that old, quiet confidence across the buttons. The same hands that had graded 3 decades of homework. That had held Frank's hand in the hospital. That had pressed the power button every night when sleep wouldn't come. And the world felt too large to carry alone. The music played. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor. Nothing else needed to happen. When Mia eventually shared the story, the response surprised her. One person wrote that they had lost their own mother not long ago. And that reading this had brought them to tears in a way they hadn't expected. Another said it had restored something in them they hadn't realized was missing, some small faith in the idea that people and companies could still respond with genuine humanity. Someone else wrote that the granddaughter was the real heart of the story. That the simple act of sitting down and writing an honest letter, with no real reason to expect a reply, had changed everything. A fourth commenter said they were going to call their grandmother that evening. And another wrote, quietly, that it was good to be reminded. The world still held moments like this. That comment drew thousands of responses from people who felt exactly the same. People responded the way they did. Because this was never really about a broken game console. It was about a woman who had carried a great deal over a long life. And had found, in the most ordinary of objects, a way to keep going. And it was about a 16-year-old girl, who had paid close enough attention to see what her grandmother needed. And who had decided that a letter was worth writing even when the odds were not in her favor. Dorothy still plays every morning. She brews her coffee, fills the bird feeder, settles into the sofa. She turns the console on and the music starts and the blocks begin to fall. It is the same game it has always been. Simple and repetitive, and somehow exactly enough. Mia still comes by when she can. She sits at the kitchen table with her homework and her hot chocolate. And sometimes she looks up and watches her grandmother play. Sometimes Dorothy holds the console out toward her, an invitation. Mia always takes it. She never gets very far before it is game over. Dorothy laughs every time. A real laugh, open and easy and completely her own. And that is everything. Thank you for staying with Dorothy and Mia's story all the way to the end. If it resonated with you, it would mean a great deal. If you'd subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take good care of yourselves.